Hello everyone. Today we're going to be learning how to work out whether a note is a half step or a whole step away. We had a little bit of trouble on this with the worksheet that I sent out, and I realized a couple of concepts that we need to go over is, first of all, what is a natural half step? And secondly, what notes are, or how notes are affected by accidentals, okay? So, right here I've got a flow chart with a couple of rules on how we're going to do things. All right. Oh, first of all, here's our big concept. When we're talking about intervals, meaning the space between notes, whether it's a half step or a whole step or any other kind of interval, we go from the bottom to the top. For example, A to B flat. Okay, if we're talking about what's the interval between B flat and A, well, we would reverse it in our mind and start with the lower note and go to the top. So I'm going to be doing that as well. So that's what it looks like for the treble clef, alto clef, and bass clef. A to B flat or B flat to A to A. It's the same thing. Okay, we go from the bottom note to the top and measure intervals that way. Okay, secondly, we're going to go over some rules to determine most efficiently if a note is, or two notes are a half step or a whole step away. Rule number one, if you see that they're the same letter name, meaning that if it's like A sharp, and B flat, or any other letter name that shares the same between the two options, but there's an accidental on them, you know that it's going to be a half step. So for instance, if you have a C and C sharp, half step. If you have an E and E flat, half step. No matter what it is, they're going to be half steps away if there's one accidental and they share the same letter name. Okay, here is rule number two. There are such things as natural half steps. They are between E and F and B and C. And this is a little bit harder to think of for string instruments, but if we look at the piano, it's easier to see. So the piano is organized, the piano keys are organized so that each key is a half step away. This is a half step, this is a half step. Even though there's no black key in between them, they're still a half step away because they're right next to each other. Half steps, okay? Half steps should sound like Jaws. You remember how we played Jaws earlier this year? And whole steps should sound like the beginnings of Happy Birthday. Okay? So that's the concept here. Now, you don't need to memorize the names of the notes on the piano keyboard. You may even have that on your worksheet study guide. But for the purposes here, I just wanted you to visualize where half steps normally lie. Because we have B and C right here. And we have E and F right here. Again, this is B and C, E and F. Next octave, B, C, E, F, and so forth. Okay? So one way that I remember it is buy cookies or eat fries. Those are some things that you can remember. Those are half steps away. Okay? So there they are on the scale if we're doing like a C major scale with no accidentals, B and C and E and F. Okay? Here's rule number three. If both notes, the top and the bottom note, have the same accidental, so like for instance, if you have D sharp and E sharp, or E flat and F flat, okay, then nothing has changed to the distance between them. So going back to rule two, let's say if we have an E and an F, half step, right? So if we have E flat and F flat, hasn't changed because they both moved in the same direction. And that's a big concept I want you to understand here, is what direction are the notes going relative to each other. So B, well, let's say if we have like G and an A compared to a G sharp and an A sharp, they would still be a whole step because G and A are not the natural half steps. Okay? So those are the rules so far and the big concepts that we want to talk about. Rule number 1 says that if they have one accidental but the same letter name, it's a half step. Natural half steps are B, C, E, and F. And rule number 3 says if they're going the same direction, the interval between them has stayed the same, whether it be a whole step or a half step, depending on rule number 2. Okay? All right, next thing I want to show you is this cool flowchart that I showed you. Now remember that B and C are natural half steps. So we're going to kind of look at everything and say every other note combination that we have is the norm. And B and C is the one that we want to watch out for because they're the exception to the normal. So the way I like to look at intervals is to say, first of all, are there any accidentals? Obviously, you can figure out whole and half steps by just this rule right here. But if these notes have accidentals, meaning a sharp or a flat, then we're going to follow this flow chart. So if they have sharp and flat, great, we follow along. Are they natural half steps? So are the sharps and flats lying on a B to C relationship or an E to F relationship? If yes, we follow here. Okay. Again, like I said before, we want to know how the notes have moved in relative to each other. So if the B went down because it's a flat, or if the C went up because it's a sharp, then the half step relationship between them has expanded. Makes sense? So B turns to B flat, or C turns to C sharp. Then you've created more space between them. They're a whole step. And that's what this means right here. If yes, they're a whole step. If no, then they're a half step. Okay, back to right here. If they have accidentals and they have a B and C and E and F, are they B and C and E and F? No. Then they follow the normal rules. So this is for notes like between C and D, between G and A, between even A and B. Okay, here is the way that it goes. Did it shrink? Did the notes move relative to each other by either having the higher note come down or the lower note come down? Wait a second, that's not right. The lower note come up. If those things have changed, then it has created less space between them. So for example, if I have an A and a B flat. Wait a second. Yes. If I had an A and a B, and the B went flat, then I've made a half step out of a whole step. Or if I have an A sharp that reaches up to the B, then I've made a half step again. Okay? Again, it's all about how close these things are to each other. You kind of have to visualize it. So if they did, if the space between them shrunk, then it's a half step. If they didn't, then not. I'll give you a few seconds to take a picture, screenshot, whatever you want to do of this flow chart. I find it really handy, especially in visualizing. Okay, so I hope you better understand how these assignments work, how these half steps and whole steps are related to each other. To reiterate, again, it's all about knowing how much space is between them, okay? If something came down or if something went up, how does that affect how much space there is between the letter names of the notes? Okay, have a good time with that. Good luck. And let me know if you have any questions in the comments, okay? Bye-bye.